But I'll have more to say that in a minute. He also, during the other infamous scandal of the Reagan administration, the so-called Iran-Contra affair, Bush was the head of something called the Special Situation Group, operating under an Executive Order 12333, which gave his Special Situation Group the authority to circumvent the U.S. Constitution. This is something that's been brought before the Congress. It's been investigated in closed session by the Congress. And it's still on the books. They can take your rights away. They don't even need the Supreme Court to do it, which the Supreme Court is doing. But under this order, they can take away all of your rights, close down banks, put curfews around cities, and so on. And Bush was the head of this during the Iran-Contra affair, during which time, of course, he knew nothing about what was going on. Now, then Bush in 1988 got elected president. We all know somewhat about what happened with that campaign. We all have heard of Willie Horton. Bush made that a household word, made that a popular campaign figure. Sometimes you thought Dukakis's running mate was Willie Horton. But the fact of the matter is, as president, what did he do? He continued what he'd been doing as vice president. And this is the nub of the matter. Bush, as president, became the person directly responsible for implementing policies that were, in effect, a return to the old policies of the British colonial era. As Kissinger has admitted, Bush has functioned as a British agent, using the U.S. military and economic power to back up the British forces. Now, in foreign policy, and this is what the New World Order is, a new colonialism. What does that mean? Well, in foreign policy, the pillars are collect the debt first, restructure economies, put them under the International Monetary Fund, and reduce population. That's the policy of the Bush administration. Something also that LaRouche refers to as technological apartheid. That is, deny technology to third world or developing sector countries. And finally, if anyone steps out of line, use force, military force, and make an example of those leaders who refuse to go along with Bush's vision of the world. For example, Panama. What happened in Panama other than a racist, genocidal attack against a people largely black and largely poor, supposedly to stop drug running? And what we did is we put in a guy of much lighter colored skin who is one of the biggest drug runners in the hemisphere. Endara, along with Guillermo Ford and several other of his henchmen. What was Iraq? What was it that happened in Iraq? And I'll get to this in a minute. It was more of the same. It was killing, and we're still killing. The Bush administration is refusing to let up the sanctions, which, according to the best estimates of a whole group of medical doctors who have been there, threaten the lives of at least 170,000 children under 5 years old. Children who are not in Saddam's military, who did not invade Kuwait, who have done nothing except try to grow up. And they're on the target list of people to be killed by Bush's New World Order. And Bush just got the Group of Seven to back that. Now, in domestic policy, what do we see? We see economic collapse, which means what in the United States? It's not too strong a word to say that there's genocide being committed in the United States. It's not necessarily people just going out shooting the political opponents of Bush, but it's the use of drugs. Do we have a drug war in this country? We have no drug war in this country. What about AIDS and the lies from the administration on AIDS and the unwillingness to fund a serious program to address this AIDS crisis? What about budget cuts, especially health care and treatment for the elderly? What is that but early death for all intents and purposes? What else is there with Bush's policies? Well, it's the emergence of scandals. Now, from this standpoint, as I go through these areas where his policy is collapsing in a little more detail, keep in mind that on top of this, we now have this health crisis. which really could be called thyroid storm. Let me just read you something from the Essential Guide to Prescription Drugs about the effects of some of the drugs that Bush is taking. There's one that's called procainamide. And according to if you read the labels on these drugs, it says side effects of this could be weakness, lightheadedness, mental depression, psychotic behavior. Now, does that make you feel safe? Knowing that a guy with this background, who already is disposed toward this, is taking a drug that inclines him towards psychotic behavior. Now again, if you know this history, some of you may wonder, is it just enhancing his proclivities already? There's another drug. The side effects of digoxin include agitation, delusions. Lyndon LaRouche recently said that Bush sometimes may wake up and think he's a Roman emperor. Difficulty with reading. Well, that's good to know. Lightheadedness, dizziness, confusion, hallucinations, and delirium. Isn't that good to have a president who is dependent now on drugs because his thyroid no longer works? Now, when you hear that, it helps explain what happened since last August 1990, with the situation in the Middle East. But keep that in mind now. Keep this health crisis in mind, plus his background, his axiomatic assumptions, how he thinks from this picture you have of his family, as we review the collapse of George Bush's fantasy world. That is, the collapse of the New World Order, which is occurring right now. And by the way, this collapse that's occurring is the best thing for us, because if Bush's policies collapse, then this means that people will be looking for alternatives. And now is the time to start mobilizing to give people an alternative. Let's start with foreign policy and the crumbling of the New World Order. What's happening in the Middle East? Well, first of all, I think most people in this country know that we were lied to about the war in the Middle East. We've been lied to over and over and over. Why? What was the purpose of this war? Well, some people would say that Bush has to have a war every year. He had a war with Panama, then we had a war last summer with Iraq, and now he's threatening to do it again with Iraq. Maybe he'd have a war with Cuba if we had enough ships to take soldiers and sailors down to Cuba. But what was it that was really behind this? First of all, Saddam Hussein was not the new Hitler. If you want to find someone who might be the new Hitler in the Middle East, I suggest you look at Henry Kissinger's good friend, Ariel Sharon, who is at this point using his position in the government of Israel to carry out a real pogrom, a real policy of genocide against the Palestinian people. If you want a real Hitler, look at Sharon. But what did Saddam do? Saddam was committed to building his nation, to developing industry. And he was under pressure from Bush, from Kuwait, from others. And Bush launched a war, supposedly, to create peace in the Middle East. Do we have peace in the Middle East? Are we any closer today to peace in the Middle East? There's an absolute refusal from the Israelis to come to the peace table. All of our Arab partners during the war were told, if you side with the United States against Saddam, as soon as the war is over, the U.S. will force Israel to the negotiating table. Well, that hasn't happened, and it's not going to happen. Because the people who work with Bush, this organized crime network around the Anti-Defamation League, and these British financiers, need the Israeli military to be built up as a defender of Anglo-American military and colonial policy in the Middle East. It's been that way for the British since the end of the 19th century, to use Palestine and the Zionist movement and what became Israel as a political force to maintain instability in that region. But look at the result of the war. Let's say Bush was right. The war was to get Iraq out of Kuwait. When they tried to leave, they were bombed. Thousands, tens of thousands, maybe even 100,000 soldiers were killed, retreating, surrendering, giving up Kuwait. What was the bombing about? of Iraq. We destroyed their infrastructure, their hospitals, their energy systems, their power grid, their food capabilities. We bombed a baby formula plant and called it a biological warfare center. From Bush's perspective, it might in fact be considered that feeding children is biological warfare, since Bush wants fewer children. Since Rubbers Bush believes in population reduction. What happened after the war? The Iraqis agreed to all the sanctions and the provisions of the United Nations. And Bush said, no, they haven't agreed on nuclear weapons, and so therefore July 25th, there's a deadline. 1 week from today, there's a deadline. And if Iraq doesn't comply, then the U.S. may be forced to take additional action. Well, the International Atomic Energy Agency today reported that Iraq has substantially complied with the UN. What did the State Department say? They said, we're highly skeptical about this report. Well, the International Atomic Energy Agency happens to be the expert agency that's supposed to oversee this. And by the way, as Al-Ahram, the Egyptian paper, pointed out, the International Atomic Energy Agency is not allowed into Israel because Israel never signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But Bush is still prepared, and I hope it won't happen, but he's still prepared, as of next week, to possibly go back with a new strike against Iraq. And what's the purpose of that? To destroy Saddam Hussein and to punish that country. To destroy that country. That's Bush's goal. But it's not going to help the New World Order because nobody in the Mideast believes George Bush anymore. Now, what about the other pillar of his foreign policy? The situation with the Soviets. Well, we've all heard what a brilliant job Bush is doing controlling Gorbachev, helping the Russian economy, trying to direct them to a free market economy. Now, if you evaluate this at all, and I'll just take 3 cases very quickly, you'll see once again the Bush policy is a complete and utter failure, which threatens to put us on the brink of a new world war. What was our policy toward Yugoslavia? Here you have 2 republics, Croatia and Slovenia, which democratically voted to separate themselves from the Serbian-dominated Yugoslavia, which is still more or less under communist control. We're supposedly anti-communist, right? We supposedly believe in democratic elections, right? So they vote to be free. And what does James Baker, Bush's longtime sidekick, tennis partner, and supposedly fellow Houstonian, tell the Yugoslav people? He says to them, we won't recognize you if you try and get free because we think you should stay under Yugoslav control. And he organizes the French to support that. And he organizes the Russians to support that. So the U.S., the French, the British, and the Russians are running around Europe saying that the only people who support a free Slovenia and Croatia are the unreconstructed Nazis in Germany. This is in the British press. They're saying that there's a Fourth Reich about to take power in Europe. So meanwhile, what happens? Well, the Yugoslav communist dictatorship centered in Serbia is sending troops in to kill the Slovenians and the Croatians. And the U.S. is supporting that central government against the people who voted for freedom. And it puts us on the verge of a war. Because Austria is involved. It's on their border. Italy's involved. And Germany is involved. And Hungary is involved. And the idiot Baker, trying to get out of the Middle East, I guess, for a couple of days. He's gotten all the mileage he needs on his frequent flyer in the Middle East. And he's not too welcome there, so he goes to Yugoslavia and intervenes in another crisis and totally destroys and damages that situation.